but
he was my first choice. I was going to say, you want to put Ryan Flaherty in there.
Yeah, maybe,
that's maybe in an afternoon game. I mean, I see it's going to be it's going to be shaken up today. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
A day off, that's a different story. I'm not saying I would be opposed to Chris Davis getting it, although Chris Davis had 2 hits on Wednesday night. But, guys struggling getting a day off. Mark Trumbo got a day off on Sunday in Chicago when the Orioles went nuts, or more specifically, Manny Machado went nuts. But, I'm just talking more in the sense of, the emotional reaction is to start benching guys and you can shake up the lineup. The Orioles shook up the lineup a little bit on Wednesday, and you saw how it turned out. Not that good. So it's just
actually
one of those
worse.
things.
They didn't score at all.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where I think, as frustrating as it is, and Buck Showalter is as frustrated as anyone else. He's the manager, and he's not going to show that, at least publicly, to everyone. But I think what you mentioned about the road, that's the big concern for me. This team is now 9 games below 500 on the road, and we've talked so much about how well they've played at Camden Yards. It's really difficult to expect to continue to play 700 ball at home, and that's not a knock on what the Orioles have done. It's just that's how hard it is to do that. To win 70% of your games in any setting against any team is really difficult. So that's where you kind of look at this, this home road breakdown and say, all right, if you're going to continue to stink up the joint on the road, and 24-33, that's a pace for a 90-plus loss kind of team. If you extrapolate that over 162, well, on the flip side, can you really expect to continue to win 7 out of every 10 home games you're playing? I mean, I expect them to continue to be really good at home, but that's difficult. That's not an easy thing to do. So that's where you kind of look at the big picture and say, all right, this team's played so well at home, and they've been really underwhelming and at times flat out bad on the road. That's just that's from the truth that they're completely done or they're doomed or anything like that. But at the same time, you just look at that season-long trend of just not being good enough on the road, and it's really difficult to try to make up all that ground at home because you're going to play some good teams at home over the final 7 weeks. You can't just automatically, not just win 2 out of 3. I mean, they've been a little bit better than that at home in their overall pace. So it's just that's something that I don't know how it changes. I mean, you mentioned, we kind of get to a point where I think a lot of this stuff gets in your head too. You just got to play better on the road. I mean, yeah, the ballparks are different, and I'm not saying Oakland's a hitter's haven in the same way that Camden Yards is.
And Oakland's not real comfortable when you walk in there either.
Yeah, no.
I've been in those locker rooms.
Right.
I had a great day in that locker room, by the way. January 14th, 2001, one of the great days of my young life, yes.
Very true.
True.
And it's funny, I saw someone note on Twitter that you could make an argument that nothing good has happened to the Orioles or the Ravens in Oakland since then, which is kind of an interesting. Not that there have been a lot of high stakes games out there since then, but I think this gets in your head though. These other ballparks, it's not as though you can't hit home runs. It's not as though you're playing in Yellowstone National Park.
Machado, that one he hit on Monday night would have been out of Yellowstone.
Yeah. So, and even over these last few nights, as much as I criticized their approach against a couple sinker ballers on Monday and Tuesday, it's not as though you've seen the Orioles hitting fly balls to the warning track through the series. It's not as though they've been, just trying to hit home runs exclusively, and that's the kind of result they've gotten. As I pointed out Wednesday, they hit a bunch of line drives. In fact, Buck Showalter in his post game even mentioned that if they had gotten a little more elevation on a few of those line drives, they might have hit them out because they hit them so hard. But they're searching right now, and you hope, and this has kind of been the formula. Every time they've had a losing streak this year, you hope you start blooping some balls in, and you get a couple early runs, and there you go. And you win a game, and then you go into San Francisco with a little bit more momentum. I mean, that's a Giants team that, as much as you look at the pitching matchups and you kind of shudder and say, wow, this offense going up against Madison Bumgarner on Saturday and Johnny Cueto on Sunday, at the same time, this is an offense that has hit and produced against some good pitchers. And that's a Giants team that overall has not played very well since the All-Star break. So you just try to get the final game of this series and then turn the page, forget about this series, and just cross over the bridge into San Fran and see what they can do against the Giants. But you got to stop the bleeding here somehow, some way. And as you mentioned, having Chris Tillman on the hill, a pretty good situation. Although you could say that, but the last 3 nights the Orioles have had fine pitching performances. That hasn't been the issue. So again, short of not allowing any runs, nothing's really guaranteed right now until they start swinging the bats better.
All right, so it might be a broom, it might not. By the time the Ravens hit the field, some thoughts about the Ravens as we enter the stadium tonight, and I'm sure it'll be a spirited crowd on a moist evening, and let's all get behind Ryan Mallett here, huh?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing, and I wrote at WNST.net, you can check it out, my preseason primer, 5 players to watch, and I've picked 5 players that I feel supremely confident are going to actually play tonight. So, I'm not picking Joe Flacco or some veteran players who might be held out. But, this game's going to feel a lot like the end of last season. And the one way that that's okay is you're still a month away from the start of the regular season, but not going to be many veteran players. Joe Flacco's not going to play. We know guys like Steve Smith and Terrell Suggs are not going to play, as they haven't even practiced yet this summer. But you're going to get
fake football. I mean, let's call it what it is, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's fake football. It's training camp. John Harbaugh even described this as more of a camp game that they're going to learn about their young guys. And one thing that we've talked about, this team, as much as we've talked about their older players needing to bounce back from injuries, as much as we've talked about guys like Eric Weddle and Ben Watson and Mike Wallace providing some things that they were lacking a year ago, this team needs some young players to step forward. I mean, that's going to be more important in my mind. You need some great young playmakers to step forward, whether it's C.J. Mosley taking another step, whether it's someone like Zadarius Smith becoming an impact kind of individual as a pass rusher, which I think the Ravens are going to need, and he's one of my 5 players that I'm watching. He's quietly had a good camp, whether it's a Terrence West, who has been arguably the star of the summer to this point, but it has to carry over in the preseason, and they're going up against the defending NFC champions. So these young guys are going to get a test, and clearly Carolina is not going to play their starters a ton, but this is going to be a nice test for some of these young players, and we'll see what they're made of. I want to see Kamale Correa look like the player who's played with an edge and a physicality in training camp. I want to see him look like that same guy in the preseason, and gives you some more optimism then for the regular season if you see some of these young guys step forward. I think one thing about last preseason, as much as we joke about fake football and we all talk about how bad the product is, and I'm waving the flag as far as that. I hate preseason football.
Oh, how long is it going to take for us? I mean, these are the nights when we're really good on Twitter, right? I mean,
sure.
These are the nights where, comedy, and being clever is what it's all about tonight.
It is, but going back to last year in the preseason, remember, they went 1-3. They won their first preseason game and then lost the last 3. As much as wins and losses in the preseason don't really have a bearing on how you're going to fare, I hate the idea of, if you have a bad preseason, that means you're a bad team, or you have a good preseason, that it automatically means you're going to make the playoffs. But I think one thing that was exposed last year was the lack of depth that the Ravens had, and that was painfully exposed over the course of the season with the injuries that they had. So, in this preseason, especially this game where you're not going to see veterans, many of them even at all, you want to see some of these young guys compete. You want to see some young guys stand out. You'd like to see Zadarius Smith, who, let's say, is playing against some of the backups for Carolina. You'd like to see him really stand out and look like a guy who can be, maybe not a Pernell McPhee clone, but certainly be a real impact third outside linebacker behind Suggs and Dumerville. You want to see stuff like that over the course of the night, and you want to see some of these young guys compete and make plays. I mean, John Harbaugh said it. This roster situation is too tight to take any projects. They are looking for guys to make plays, and if they don't do it, then they're going to continue to look for other guys to make plays. So, that's where you get a little more context. And as much as we've talked about all these practices the last 2 weeks, get an opportunity to go up against another opponent. You want to see these guys fare well.
As a journalist wannabe for you as a kid, as a journalist wannabe for me as a kid, I think I've had more than 3 decades of John Saunders in my living room, right?
Yeah.
From WMAR and then obviously up to ESPN. And, I didn't have a lot of interaction with him. I mean, I had run into him a handful of times over the years and always had sort of a Baltimore connection and some mutual friends and, the Vince Bagleys and the Chris Thomases and the people of his era. But more than that, the sports reporters and what that represented, after the death of Dick Schaap, and Jeremy Schaap had sat in as well, who also has been very kind over the years, but kind of a stunning loss for ESPN. I mean, I was out at Glory Days Grill, just doing a little bit of business, having some lunch on Wednesday in Towson. I looked up on the TV screen, I saw it, and I'm like, whoa. That kind of came as a shocker. And, my John Saunders story would be that back when I worked at the Sports First and the News America in 1984 and 85, we had the first generation of opinions, right? Because we had extra space, not a traditional newspaper. It was a tab. So every night as an intern, I had to call and get three media people on television to give quotes on a topic, So today it would be, what do you think of Michael Phelps or whatever? So they would say, here's a list of 200 phone numbers, because there was no email, there was no fax, there was no carrier pigeon. There was just pick up the phone. And I would call, sometimes I call Chris Thomas, sometimes I would call ESPN, and Chris Berman or Tom Mees would pick up the phone in their newsroom at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and I'd say, Mr. Berman, this is Nestor Aparicio, I'm calling from Sports First in Baltimore. What do you think of Michael Phelps? And he would give me some quote, and I would take his quote, and we would have a little quote box, of opinions, what they're saying or whatever. And I remember calling John Saunders all the time, and he would always have something thoughtful to say. And this was back at, when I was 15, 16 years old. So those are I had to think about that when John Saunders passed, because I knew I had come in contact, but that was my first contact with him. And you learn a lot when you get somebody on the phone and you say you're calling from a newspaper and say, give me a hot take in 1984 on something, and he did. And I always remember that. I remember all those guys that were nice to me when I was a kid, and I guess everyone at ESPN's blown away, but a real tragedy for journalism and sports journalism as well.
No doubt about it. I mean, the pro's pro. That's the description you kept hearing about John Saunders. And I never had the privilege to meet him. I clearly, him being at WMAR, was a little bit before what I could remember, being born.
You don't remember being an infant?
but he just, the pro's pro. There was never any shtick. It was never about him. It was always about the work, and I think that's something to be admired. And for me, I just think back to him kind of being the voice of along with Keith Jackson doing play-by-play, but from a studio standpoint, he was kind of the voice of college football for me growing up. Being in the studio for ABC, you've heard so many of the stories on Wednesday about the people he touched, and as much as everyone admired him as a professional, I think you really heard a lot about John Saunders, the man, that so many people at ESPN expressed over the course of the day and are continuing to over the last couple of days. I mean, you look at some of the personalities that ESPN has lost over the last few years, and Stu Scott, of course, tragically to cancer. But even just the Mike Tiricos of the world who have moved on. John Saunders was right up there with Bob Lee and Chris Berman. Guys that have really waved the ESPN flag for a long time in a very professional way, and just really tough to see that. And a Canadian guy, loved hockey, which I know you can appreciate that, and just someone who always about the work, and certainly someone that I've looked up to a lot as far as professionals that you try to mimic, to kind of paint yourself to be more like that. John Saunders certainly has been someone like that for me, even though I never had the chance to meet him.
Hey, man, we're going to hang out this evening. We're going to be funny on Twitter, I promise. We're going to be timely and insightful and funny. I did mention funny. So that after the first quarter, you need to be funny. So we hope that we have a better sense of humor than a sweep at the hands of the Oakland A's. You can reach Luke at WNST.net, as well as Baltimore Luke on Twitter. I'm Nestor. This is WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.